Hi, everybody. My name is David Michelson. Today is October 14th, 2025, and I'm making a short presentation about a ballot initiative called IP28, which I am one of the chief petitioners for, because I was scheduled to participate in a conference, the Animal Law and Advocacy Conference, that took place in Toronto this last September, put on by Animal Justice. I was invited to be part of a panel that I thought was very cool about shifting the status quo using legal tools in, I would say, sort of imaginative or bold ways, creating conversation and shifting public consciousness around animals. I unfortunately was not able to get on the train to get to Toronto in time, last minute, unfortunately. But I had already prepared the slides and I was excited to get to share, so I thought making this video would be a fun way of still getting to at least participate a little bit. For many of you watching, you may be already familiar with our campaign, in which case you still might take away a couple interesting insights from this, but hopefully there's also some people who are watching this and are either only loosely familiar with the campaign or maybe even haven't heard of it before. So I'm just going to go through my slides. Initially, it was a pretty we had 10 minutes, and at least now it'll probably not take much longer than that, but I won't be as concerned about time since my other panelists have already given their presentations. So the topic of, or the title of this presentation is What If We Banned Killing Animals? And I actually borrowed this from the title of the interview, or the Q&A, that Nathan Robinson did, the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs. We were in their most recent magazine that was all about animals. I definitely recommend checking that out. And throughout the magazine, there are a bunch of different Q&As from different groups and activists in this animal rights movement. And our Q&A was titled, What If We Banned Killing Animals? And that really sort of prompts the important question that we want people to ask, that we think would shift the status quo if we were asking it in a very political context in particular, which I'll talk more about. But first, I also want to point out right above my little icon here is another chief petitioner for the campaign, Isaac. We were collecting signatures at, I think this is the Kenton Street Fair in Portland, Oregon. We're getting to ask people, what if we banned killing animals? And this is us doing so in action. So briefly, what is Initiative Petition 28 for anyone who has never heard of this before? We also informally will call it IP 28. That just means that we were the 28th initiative petition that was submitted for the 2026 election cycle. So we are trying to get on the ballot for 2026. I'll talk more about that in the next slide too. But the initiative would criminalize breeding practices, specifically artificial insemination, injuring/killing animals, including for food, hunting, and fishing, creates a transition fund, which I'll talk more about. And there are some exceptions, specifically for self-defense and any veterinary care. So this is a pretty bold initiative, I would say, that works by removing exemptions from Oregon's pre-existing animal cruelty laws that extends those same protections our companion animals have to animals on farms, research labs, and out in the wild. It impacts and covers mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish who are legally considered animals under Oregon state law. To give an example, animal abuse in Oregon is defined as the intentional injury of an animal, intentional, knowing, or reckless injury of an animal. That definition to me makes sense. I think to many people it makes sense. But of course, we intentionally injure them when we slaughter animals, when we hunt animals, when we experiment on animals. The reason those aren't crimes is there's a state law that says the following activities are exempt from our cruelty laws. And this initiative removes those exemptions, everything but a pre-existing veterinary exception. That way, things like spaying, neutering, and vet-administered euthanasia is still allowed under the law. And we also created a self-defense exception. So that's why it says exceptions there. Those are the two exceptions. Otherwise, it would ban killing animals, including for food, including for research, including for hunting, whether that's recreational hunting, hunting for food, hunting for wildlife management. Pretty bold initiative. The reason it criminalizes breeding practices is because it would classify that as animal sexual assault, right now, animal sexual assault is only considered assault if it's done for the perpetrator's pleasure. That's written into the law. This removes that. So in a human-to-human context, we of course wouldn't call it sexual assault only if the person doing the assault got off, right? That would seem like a very, I think, jarring way to write the law. That is how it's written for the case of animal sexual assault. It's really more about punishing the crime, the moral crime of bestiality, rather than considering the victim in this particular scenario. So it would also criminalize artificial insemination of animals as well. It is a ballot initiative, so that means in at least Oregon, if we collect a certain number of signatures by a certain deadline, we will be on the ballot, and voters will then get the chance, Oregon registered voters will get the chance to vote on whether we want it to pass. There are about 23 or 24 states in the United States that have a ballot initiative process. If you go to Ballotpedia, you can learn more a little bit about some of the distinctions here. In this case, this color-coded map, the dark, I would call that greenish, and then the light or turquoise-ish color, those two colors, they are states that have a process similar to what we have in Oregon, where you can get something on the ballot to either change state statutes, which are different than constitutional amendments, but they also usually allow either one or both of those. There are, interestingly, two provinces in Canada. I was doing a little research since the conference I was going to present to was in Canada. British Columbia and Alberta both have citizen-initiated amendments or citizen-initiated ballot initiatives similar to ours. And Alberta's, I believe, is very new. I think they just amended it, sort of revised it in 2025. And I think it was only first being considered a couple years before that, if even that long. I'm not too familiar with Canadian law and variations between provinces, but I did at least want to look into it. If someone in Canada wants to do something kind of similar to what we're doing, I think that is possible depending on what the animal cruelty laws there are. But so in Oregon more specifically, a brief overview of the process is we draft the initiative text, which we did. The first iteration of this was actually November of 2020. We were trying to get on the 2022 election cycle. Then we resubmitted for 2024, and then we resubmitted for 2026. And each time we've gotten a lot more momentum. The first iteration, we collected maybe 1,000 to 2,000 signatures. The second, we were close to 40,000, and now we're already close to 90,000 and on track still to qualify, which is our the best chance we have yet. But anyway, we drafted the initiative text. Then we collected the first 1,000 signatures, which are like the sponsorship signatures. This process varies state to state. Some states don't have this, but in Oregon, those first signatures sort of trigger a review by the Attorney General. They don't really look at it until then. If like 20 people just submit initiatives, but no one ever intends to pursue them, the Attorney General doesn't spend time reviewing things that are not going to go anywhere. But then they review it. We did that sponsorship signatures. They reviewed the initiative. They created the summary text that would actually show up on people's ballots, which is cool, and confirmed that it would have the effects that we thought it would have. Then we got approved to collect the rest of the signatures, which we started last summer, so July of 2024. And we have been collecting pretty much ever since, with a little bit of a slowdown last winter. We have until the beginning of July of 2026 to turn in all the signatures that we have. Oregon is one of the few states in the United States that allows for up to 2 years to collect signatures, and we did take full advantage of that. We are a very grassroots campaign. I'll talk more about the trajectory a little bit later. But so we have until that point in time, and then they will review the signatures, make sure they are valid signatures. And if we cross 117,173, I think is the full number, then we will appear on the ballot and be voted on November of 2026. It's a high overview of the process. Why are we doing this? So getting to really the core topic at hand, the shifting the status quo, our campaign is very much inspired by the women's suffrage movement, who used the similar ballot initiative tactic to get the right to vote. They forced the conversation in many different states and usually over many election cycles. And they saw that that generated a lot of conversation. So I pulled up two quotes here that are from the History of Women's Suffrage, volume 1 through 6. A lot of the activists documented the struggle, and I highly recommend. It's a very, very large volume. It's indexed well, and you can usually find online versions to help search for things that you find interesting more quickly. But here are two excerpts. It is safe to say that from the middle of January 1877 until the following October, the most prominent theme of public discussion in Colorado was this question of suffrage for women. Miners discussed it around their campfires, and freighters on their long, slow journeys over the mountain trails argued pro and con, whether they should let women have the ballot. In Kansas, 1867, there was no chance of victory, but the seed sown has silently taken root and sprung up everywhere. Or rather, the truths then spoken and the arguments presented, sinking into the minds and hearts of the men and women who heard them, have been like leaven, slowly but surely operating until it seems to many that nearly the whole public sentiment of Kansas is therewith leavened. What I like is this illustrates exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to shift the status quo. We're trying to get people talking about animal rights in a new context. This worked for the women's suffrage movement, and I think it will work for the animal rights movement. In that struggle for suffrage, there were, I think this is 54 ballot initiatives that were attempted, many of which did not pass. And in Oregon in particular, I have highlighted here, it took them 6 attempts at the ballot before the first one finally passed. In Kansas, one of the quotes that I shared, it only got 31% of the vote. That Colorado one, 1877, got 32% of the vote. They still viewed those as victories. And I think that by itself is a helpful thing to mention. Part of what I want to shift in the animal rights movement is how we define what winning is and what winning looks like, because I don't think it always is going to be whether or not something passes on the ballot. I think we need to be more strategic and think in terms of what needs are getting met, be very clear with what those needs are. And I think for our campaign, a win at this point is getting on the ballot, because it would be the first time in world history that any state has been able to vote on whether we want to ban killing animals. I think that's a win. So certainly with suffrage, they were persistent. We also want to be persistent. And so one of the other ways that we can measure success is, are we able to build an organization that can keep getting this on the ballot in multiple election cycles and in multiple states over time? By getting on the ballot, we hope to broadcast our message quite broadly and identify other people who resonate with this tactic and want to join in. So we've been collecting since last summer, so I guess a year and a couple extra months. When we got to about October of last year, we did run into an issue where we were lower on funding, and a donation that we had planned around didn't come through. So we were trying to then fundraise quite a bit. We were luckily able to reach a $100,000 pledge drive that completed this August. A little bit longer than what we were hoping for, but it did allow us to ramp back up. So you can kind of see on the graph here, this shows the blue line is our total over time, and then the sort of reddish lines are individual total signatures per day. And so you can kind of see things ramping back up. We had some success of fundraising over the winter, and then the rest of it came a little bit later. So we just in this like August, September period have been ramping back up. Luckily, we have until, again, beginning of July 2026 to turn in all these signatures. We are running on a much smaller budget than most campaigns. In our last Oregon election cycle, the 2 initiatives that qualified, one spent a little over $2 million to qualify for the ballot, and one spent $900,000 to qualify for the ballot. Just the qualification part of the ballot, not the campaigning afterwards. And our budget right now is like $250,000. So it's much smaller. This was when I was also going to mention that if you find this campaign inspiring, I really would appreciate becoming a monthly donor at any amount, $1, $2, $5, whatever you can afford. If you can afford more, great. But having those monthly donors really helps us make sure that we have funding throughout the rest of the campaign cycle. And I was going to mention, since was intended for a Canadian audience, that anyone around the world can donate to this campaign. It is a ballot initiative campaign and not a campaign for an elected official. In the United States, foreigners, any non-U.S. Citizen can't donate to a political campaign of a candidate, but they can donate to a ballot initiative campaign. So if you are in Canada watching this and want to donate, I would appreciate any support you're willing to provide to make sure we get on the ballot. And the last slide, so I wanted to bring it back to the main topic again, shifting the status quo, and be more clear. I wanted to be more clear around what status quos are we trying to shift and among which groups. And there are really two groups that we want to shift the status quo among. The first being animal rights activists themselves. And I wrote under here needs consciousness and baby steps. For needs consciousness, I haven't demonstrated it that much in this presentation, but our campaign, very similar to being inspired by the women's suffrage movement, is very much inspired by nonviolent communication, sort of a communication model where it enables us to connect with people at the level of needs. And we understand that right now people are contributing to killing animals, either directly or indirectly, because they are attempting to meet their needs. Sometimes they're successfully meeting them, some would say, other times they're not successfully meeting them. But they are certainly trying to meet needs through killing animals. We want to acknowledge that, and we also want to find an alternative strategy to meet those needs. That kind of language is what we use on the campaign when we're talking to people who are signing, when we promote our campaign on social media. We don't want to contribute to having enemy images of others who are contributing in some way to killing animals. We certainly don't want people to be doing that anymore. We're trying to ban that strategy. But we're not trying to ban people from meeting their needs. We actively want to meet everyone's needs. That's very different language than what I typically see in the animal rights movement. In our campaign, we avoid using moralistic language that implies wrongness, that implies judgments. We evaluate, but only in terms of whether things are meeting needs or not. And importantly, we try to bring to the surface that animals have needs too. And we want people to meet those needs as well as our needs. And we don't believe that they're in conflict. The needs are not in conflict. The strategies are in conflict. So because we don't see this language often in the animal rights movement, we think a benefit of our campaign is that it will promote that use of language if it appears to work in practice while we're campaigning. And the second part is shifting what a baby step is. So I was I was petitioning in Salem, and someone stopped by, and she understood what we were doing, was excited to sign, and was talking to me for a little while because this is the first time she had come across an initiative like this. She wasn't herself vegan. She had told me that she stopped eating cows, or no, I think she stopped eating pigs, but had still been eating some other animals. And anyway, just to give a point that this wasn't like a vegan who was like, oh yeah, this is so cool. One of the things she told me while we were talking was, yeah, this is just a baby step. I'm happy to support, this increment. Getting on the ballot is a first step. And she seemed to understand that we don't need to think of incrementalism as having smaller goals or smaller visions, I should say. That's probably a more accurate term, a smaller vision. We can have increments on the way to the vision. For instance, being the first state to vote on banning killing of animals. Yes, banning killing of animals would be a quite big step if we just went straight there. And I would love if we just went straight there. If everyone woke up tomorrow and decided we were going to do that, we could do it. But our goal, our incremental step, is to be the first state to even vote on something like this. That's something that is doable, that is practical, that is actionable. We're demonstrating right now that we're able to qualify if we end up putting in enough effort to do it. Reframing what is an increment, what is the end goal, and not making some of these smaller steps the end goal in and of itself, which I think does tend to happen among some movements of reform, where the reforms become the end goal, or at least get portrayed as the end goal. Okay, so I wanted to shift what it means to be an incrementalist, want to shift our way we talk about why people are killing animals. And then among the general public, and I'll shift my little pip here on the other side. We want this campaign to expose people to alternative strategies to killing animals for whatever the reason people are currently killing animals. That could mean presenting alternatives to research. We often get asked, what would we do if we don't use animals in labs? And we get to share them. Things like doing testing on human tissue cells, which is something that's being done, growing human organs in a lab. That's really cool and a thing that we're doing, using more computer models that we have access to now. There are cool alternatives that exist and potentially way more to come in the future. We want to share that with people. Often that's the first time many people that we get who are signing, who ask us about it, that's the first time they've heard of most of those alternatives. I think that's really cool. We get to talk about alternatives to eating animals. What would that look like? Other ways, other sources of nutrients, whether that's the whole food plant base, which is great, whether that involves more of the plant substitutes, also a strategy that doesn't involve killing animals, or whether that includes lab-grown meat, which is a strategy that doesn't involve killing animals. Our campaign doesn't have a specific strategy alternative in mind. We just want to present all of the options and say, let's take the killing of animals off the table. What other strategies can we come up with? So, and same with wildlife management. Actually, I'll call out that one too, because it does come up quite often. People ask, how are we going to manage populations? I tell them, well, there's been programs that introduce sterile males into a population. That tends to work pretty well. And that doesn't involve killing anyone. There are alternatives, non-lethal ways, strategies that we can use to meet all of the needs we're currently trying to meet. It's just a matter of talking about them and taking them seriously, which I hope our campaign will help do. And then the last part is that getting something like this on the ballot that asks people whether they want to ban killing animals, it's a systemic question. We're not asking individuals to adopt really a change in their individual lifestyle. They might choose to do that, and I would certainly support them in doing that. But we are trying to shift people away from thinking of animal rights as solely an individual issue. And I emphasize solely. It's not that it's not an individual issue at all, but it's not solely that. I think right now, the vast majority of people, when they think about animal rights, might think of just adopting a vegan diet, and that's like the action that they can take. And that can be hard when you're going against a stream that does not encourage going vegan. We want people to see it as also a systemic issue and a particularly political issue. We want it to be not just systemic versus individual, but civic versus consumer. There's research that Pax Fauna has done. They talk about this quite often. I would check them out if you're interested more in that like civic versus consumer mind frame. We think that a ballot initiative like this, which would ask over 3 million registered voters, do you want to ban killing animals? That would start getting them to think about this in a civic and systemic point of reference framework. So that's how we want to shift the status quo. Thank you so much for listening to this or watching this if you did. And if you have any questions, I really would enjoy talking more about it. You can email me at david@yesonip28.org. And I recommend checking out our website, yesonip28.org. If you go to our updates/blog section, there's some articles on there that you might find interesting, more deep dives into the women's suffrage movement. There is an aspect that talks all about our transition fund, which I didn't talk much about now, but the initiative does include a fund that would be overseen by a lot of different people and could be used to pay for things like job retraining, income replacement, increasing food access, animal care, etc. Whole article that I have talking about that. We talk about why we don't include cultural exemptions to our initiative. This would ban killing animals for, again, any purpose other than self-defense and veterinary care. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter that just kind of gives high-level updates about the campaign. And yeah, lots of ways to connect. If you are anywhere in Oregon or near Oregon and want to petition, that's also a great way to help out. But just look forward to hearing people, and definitely sharing the word is also a great way to support. So thank you, everyone. hope you're having a great day. Yeah, hope to talk to you soon.